So Nigel Farage recently did an interview with Stephen Edgington, and this has been relatively controversial among people on the right because it wasn't very good. And it seemed that Stephen Edgington is a very good chap, gave him lots of open goals in order to score some really solid political points, and Nigel Farage refused them at every turn. And the reason I think this is important is because Nigel Farage is portrayed as the Donald Trump of Britain. And one thing that Donald Trump did, as you saw with the recent Haitian controversy in America, is he says things that are bombastic in order to puppeteer the media. They're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats, and now that's all people know, that's all people remember from the debate that apparently he lost with Kamala Harris. And yet it's just Donald Trump that everyone remember because of the one bombastic line that everyone focused on. And essentially, Edgington was giving Farage the opportunity to go, right, okay, you're going to get a bunch of bombastic headlines out of this, so what do you want to say? And Farage refused to engage at every point. Before we go on, though, the bulk of my analysis is going to actually be drawn from Dr. Nima Parvini's article in Islander issue 2. This is called Boomer Truth, a Eulogy, because we can see very much how Nigel Farage is within the 20th century paradigm when it comes to politics, and how the world has changed underneath that paradigm to now the things that Farage is saying just don't feel sufficient to deal with our current political moment. So I've read it. I can tell Nigel Farage hasn't read it, but you can read it by going onto the website shop.lotus.com and purchasing it now, because it won't be available for very long, and it won't be very long until you receive it either, because we're going to be printing them in batches. So there was quite a distance between ordering it and receiving it. That's shrunk now. So let's go to the first clip where Stephen was just asking him directly about demographic change. Samson, do you mind taking the reins?
Do you think that immigration represents a major threat to Britain from a demographic perspective? So in the last 20 years, the white British population has declined from 87% to 74%. Is that a concern of yours?
No, that's not a concern of mine. What is a concern of mine is, in many cases, the lack of integration. We see that writ large by the new kind of politics that's emerging, sectarian voting along religious lines. I never really thought I'd see that in England in my lifetime. I mean, I grew up seeing what it did in Northern Ireland, and it's not very welcome.
So that's a fascinating answer to me, and I just want to pick this apart a little bit, because the sectarian voting and conflict in Northern Ireland is purely based on ethnic demographics. It's a very hard line, and I grew up with this looming over my head because my dad was in the Royal Air Force. So I grew up on military camps, and there was constantly the threat of IRA bombing. So this is something that resonates with me, but that was obviously due to ethnic differences. And so to say, well, I'm not concerned about the fact that there are other ethnicities being mass imported into the United Kingdom, into England specifically, but I am concerned about the sectarian conflict that comes out of it. It's like, well, these things are not separate. There's a direct connection between the sectarianism and the ethnicities themselves.
I mean, Northern Ireland, that's not a problem of integration, is it? I mean, it's a false analogy, totally.
It's a different problem.
Yeah.
There's also a couple of false premises in there. The first being that there is such a thing as non-sectarian politics. Because sectarian, in his mind, is religious conflicts. But religion is a set of value judgments that are incommensurate with one another. And so the idea is there can be a politics above value judgments, which is the exact paradigm that led to Blair's success, putting things on rails and saying there are certain things outside of discussion. There are certain things that can't be resolved through... All things can be resolved through pure politics and turning the managerial dials.
To push back on that, I think Nigel would say it's not that there isn't a set of values at question. I think he would say, well, it used to be that it was more personal interest that dictated politics, as in working class people voted Labour, and so the middle and upper classes voted Conservative because they wanted to maintain a sort of balance of interests. Whereas this has become religious, and I don't know why he won't say ethnic, because it's very clearly an expression of ethnic groups. It's not incontestable. This has become something that's now not about personal interests, about group interests between these conflicting groups.
And that's downstream of demographics, because
it's exactly
in homogenous societies, ideas precede identity. In heterogeneous societies, identity precedes ideas.
Well, the question of identity in a homogeneous society just doesn't have to come up.
Yeah.
It's just there's no need for it to come up.
And then the other thing is as well, as you've said before, people are bearers of civilization. Culture is a story that certain people tell themselves about themselves over time. So if you import people en masse into a country, they live among themselves, they don't have a reverence for the culture and the country they're coming into. They see it as an economic zone, and also that country is actively attacking its own history by saying it bears the lodestone of unique white supremacist historical guilt. Then one, they're not assimilating into anything, but two, they are telling themselves a completely incommensurate cultural story because the ethnicity factors into their likelihood of buying into another one. So even if he thinks ethnicity doesn't matter and demography doesn't matter, it matters to the new arrivals who are not going to buy in. So integration isn't possible.
I just want to say, there are lots of people on the right who say, "Oh, integration is a falsehood." I don't agree with that. But I think integration is a difficult thing, and it has to essentially be done by massive personal commitment, and usually that's intermarriage. You have to marry someone in that community, and then your children are a natural part of that community, and you're bonded to it. You've got nowhere to go now, so you have to become, the foreigner who goes to the bar, and then you'll be brought into the community. Everyone will be kind to you and all that sort of thing. That can happen. But that can't happen if, of course, millions and millions and millions are being dumped into an area that is already mostly ethnic minority. What are you integrating into?
And the demography of intermarriage is only ever about 7 to 11% of the population anyway.
Oh, yeah.
So you have to set expectations of integration according to the organic desires of the host population. And so unless you try and mandate intermarriage overnight, again, integration is very, very difficult, particularly with a culture that doesn't even believe in itself.
Yeah, that hasn't even been trying, but sorry.
No, I was just saying, integration has worked. Integration does work. Nobody talks badly of the Huguenots.
Yeah.
Who came over, 50,000 of them.
Raj is descended from Huguenots.
Yeah, I have some Huguenot blood somewhere in far back in my family as well. They integrated, but it was 50,000 Northern French Protestants. We're talking about degrees of separation as well. I think that's another thing. Concentric circles working outwards. The further outwards you get, the harder it becomes. And so, but it's a nonsense. Everything that he said.
But it can be done. But as you were saying, it's an effort of will. I know this because my own grandfather came from St Helena, very different place to England, but he just it was an effort of will. He wanted the thing, and we're not bringing in people who want the thing. So why are we even having a conversation?
And the host population has to want them as well. And the final thing I will say is that I listen to this and I hear, right, you're not addressing my concerns, because I listened to a trigonometry episode. He spent 10% of it on immigration and the majority on supply side tax reforms. And the thing I will say is pretending that ethnicity and demography doesn't have any bearing on culture. Okay, that might well be fine for you, Nigel, because you're.
Well, no, he does concede that it has, an impact on culture. It's not his concern because he differentiates and separates the two things.
But this is the point. Pretending you can differentiate and separate them. It might be fine for Nigel because he's nearly 70 and wealthy. I'm a third of his age, and I'm going to be living with the consequences of pretending that it has nothing to do with it for a very long time. So it is annoying to me.
Well, you know what's interesting? Let's. The way his mind works on this, I find quite interesting. Let's go to the second clip.
No, I think the real problem is this, that the population explosion, and remind ourselves that it's 10 million increase since Blair came to power, 6 million increase since the Conservatives came to power in 2010, is having a negative effect on the lifestyles of pretty much everybody in the country, whether it is access to public services, whether it is the complete unaffordability or impossibility of young people to get on the housing ladder. Just think about it. We need to build a new home every 2 minutes just to cope with the last 2 years' levels of legal, let alone illegal, legal net migration, the impact on, everything, traffic, you name it. Our lives have been devalued. And now we learn that even the one big reason why we were all told we've got to put up with this, we're beginning to learn that's not true either, namely the economy.
So if I'm just one thing that I find very frustrating about this is a very typical boomer perspective. So, material. Our lives are being ruined. Our monetary power is being devalued. If we can just go to the links I've got there, Samson, just because he is correct about this, just to be clear. Get back on there. There we go. Yeah. So this is the UK's latest GDP estimate, and no growth in June. Well, I mean, there's been very, very little growth. Basically, the more immigration goes up, the more the economy grinds to a halt. Obviously true. This is, of course, costing us billions. As everyone knows, Andrea Jenkins thinks it's 14 billion every year. And Labour accept this because Yvette Cooper said, yep, quote, we need to clear the backlog of asylum claims that we have inherited from the Conservatives because they're costing us billions of pounds. But this is, of course, illegals. A recent study found that economically inactive legal immigrants costing Britain about £23 billion over the last 4 years. So it's not that Farage is wrong, but was this the question that was being asked?
The premise of this is that if we could mobilise the private sector to build enough studio apartment battery farms to house the entire third world tomorrow, and all the trains still ran on time, it would be okay.
Yeah, so I mean, he's perfectly happy with the vision of Britain as a giant factory farm, right? I mean, no longer England's green and pleasant land.
As long as the culture's okay.
As long as
they're all wearing their Union Jack hats. Yeah.
And this is
last night of the proms.
Yeah. This is the thing that Eric Kaufman talks about in White Shift, and he analyses the Brexit referendum pretty well, and he said, actually, the majority of Brexit voters were concerned about sovereignty, immigration, and cultural cohesion above economic matters. Yeah. So they were willing to take an economic hit, and that's why
I'm one of those.
I'm one of those. And so when politicians go out and they think that making a purely economic or infrastructure-based argument about immigration keeps them from accusations of racism by the sphere, one, it won't. They'll still call you racist anyway. Two, you're actually alienating your core voters because you're cloaking cultural concerns in economic terms. They're concerned primarily about the cultural concerns because even if all the trains were cheap and accessible, if I've got 100 foreigners around me playing TikToks aloud in random different languages, it's going to feel very uncomfortable. And that's happening now.
Just going to feel alienated even if they're all quiet.
See, what I don't understand is, I understand that Nigel Farage doesn't want to talk about race. He just doesn't want to talk about race or ethnicity, whatever you want to call it. But there are ways that he could have answered the first question in particular, that would actually that would have satisfied everybody, basically. His entire sort of core constituency. He could just have said, Britain has been subject to an unprecedented social experiment since 1997. Mass immigration was a policy that was instituted by the Labour Party specifically to change the nature of Britain, socially and politically, to rub the right's nose in diversity, as Andrew Nether, the Labour advisor, said. I mean, he could just have said, look, this is a social experiment that's gone terribly wrong. If he'd said something like that, then that would have been fine.
No one would have complained because it would be true.
It's also not a race-based concern because the Albanians are pretty white, and I wasn't too keen when thousands of those are coming across the channel either. So
exactly, this is why I'm much more specific about it being ethnicity, because I think that really is the core of the issue. I mean, at the moment, the East End is populated by Frenchmen. I'm not happy about it, actually. That's where the Cockneys should live. The French have got France, theoretically, and they should bloody well go back there. But anyway, let's move on, because Stephen Edgington does do a good job of dragging him back to the core point. No, Nigel, we want to talk about demographics specifically. Let's play this one.
You say you're not concerned about demographic changes in Britain, but we have seen the fastest and most rapid decline of the white British population ever experienced in British history. This has happened in such a tiny, short period of time. And I think some people, many people in Britain are concerned about that. Majority cities that were once, 90% white British are now majority ethnic minority. Look at London, Leicester, Birmingham. So why isn't that a concern of yours?
Look, I'm very concerned that we have whole areas of our towns and cities that are unrecognisable as being English. But they're not unrecognisable as being English because of skin colour. They're unrecognisable because of culture.
Right, a few things there. First of all, English as an ethnicity is white. That has no moral content. So yes, there is an element of it being recognisable. King John did not ascribe to English values, which is why we needed Magna Carta to constrain him. There might be a wonderful Nigerian chap who's lived in Lagos all his life, who waves the Union Jack and is a Christian and who would be a great neighbour. Does not make him more English than King John.
But the issue is that culture is what people do, and so it's a product of those individual particular people. It's not something that is just floating in the ether that someone right the way across the world can say, you know what, I'm going to become English for a day. It's just not an option. Right, it is only produced by English people, and those people who are, I guess, married into or very much part of the tribe of Englishness,
Like Ben Habib.
It doesn't exist outside of that, and so Nigel is committed to English cities being mostly English if he wants English culture out of English cities. And so he says, I'm concerned about this, but I'm only concerned on a cultural level. But you can't distinguish the cultural level from the ethnic level because the culture is a product of the ethnicity, which is why he can't describe it without naming the ethnicity it comes from. It's English culture. There's not some other kind of, abstract noun or something. It is the culture that comes from the English ethnicity.
Do you know who was concerned about this a couple of years ago? Nigel Farage.
That's true.
When the census came out, and he did a down-camera video saying it's essentially a problem that London is now minority white English. And Sajid Javid responds to him saying, so what?
Yeah.
And now Nigel Farage has taken Sajid Javid's opinion.
Well, exactly. Like, this is the weird thing about Reform becoming like a values party. It's like, weirdly enough, Labour aren't a values party. Labour are actually very specific about the ethnic groups that they support and will pick out.
But this is precisely the line of reasoning that's being used in Springfield, Ohio, to justify the Haitian invasion of Springfield, Ohio. You have people, local businessmen, local community leaders, saying things like, "Oh, they've revitalized the factories, they've revitalized the Pentecostal churches and the Protestant churches and whatever. Well, it's pure culture." It's interesting and very strange and disappointing, actually, to hear Nigel Farage basically using replacementist kind of arguments to justify how British cities could actually be made British again simply through through values rather than demographics.
But even then, he's still committed in a way that he's not admitting.
Sure.
That's the problem. By the very nature of the construct of I want English culture and English cities, he's committed to an ethnic argument. And the attempt to separate it out into a values argument isn't true. It's a false argument.
It reminds me of Richard Dawkins saying, I'm a cultural Christian, I love all the hymns at Christmas time, I love the churches, but I'm going to do literally everything I can to discourage people from attending them in the first place, and then wonder why they get turned into mosques.
Yeah. Now, Farage is not like that, obviously. He's not a warrior against English culture or anything. So I don't want to make it seem like we're saying that. But
no, but he's antithetical to the demographic change. Sorry, not antithetical. Apathetic.
Yeah.
Sorry, yes.
But it's the boomer mindset. Again, if it wasn't for Neem Parnavini's work on this, I wouldn't be able to see this so clearly. But it's the boomer mindset as if there is something that is different and detached. The culture is separate from the people. It's like, no, the culture is a product of the people, and without the people, you don't get the culture. And it's literally that simple. And it happens everywhere, and everyone knows it happens everywhere, which is why John Cleese was like, wow, London isn't an English city. Good point. On every single level, London isn't an English city. It's not demographically English. It's not culturally English. It's not like spiritually English. It's probably not legally English in most parts. Like on every bloody level. And Farage is, again, but it's the boomer mindset. They've got this like externalist view that we'll get onto in a minute, because in fact let's go to the next clip.
I mean, look, the truth is, I genuinely think that the British are the most open-minded, most accepting people, that you'd frankly find, I think, from any Western country. But it's the cultural impact of this. It is the societal impact of this. You look at our cities now, people often don't even know the names of their neighbours. It is the breakdown of communities. It's why kind of in the election campaign I said, family, community, country, these are the things that we're going to stand for in Reform. So yes, of course, I'm deeply worried, but perhaps for different reasons than your question.
I don't know why these things keep going off. But that particularly bothers me, because what is he appealing to there? He is appealing to some sort of abstract metaphysical entity called society. He's not appealing to the genuine real human beings that are actually having their lives affected. And so you've got this kind of external institutional view where it's like, okay, I could be concerned inside the frame of the family, the local community, but instead I'm looking at it from outside as someone who's just like, oh, well, that doesn't look very good, as if it's gone a wrong color or something. You know, it's like, no, sorry, Nigel, we're really having real human problems here. And for some reason, you're not acknowledging that with these answers.
Well, whose family, whose community, whose country? Exactly. And this is why you said boomer politics. Ever since the Second World War, it has been the case that if you stake a claim in a given people, history, culture, country, you are indistinguishable from Nazi Germany. That is a fiction, but it is something that I think has been learned, and this is why, left to their own devices, the boomers will fall back on liberalism. Because in all of those statements, Farage could have been talking about Muslims.
He could have been talking about any country anywhere.
Yes, but specifically, you value family, you value community, you value your country. Okay, well, Mohammed bin Salman could have said that.
Who doesn't? Yeah. So let's go to the next one, because this is where Stephen starts getting a bit edgy.
If Britain is made up of a majority of immigrants and their descendants, is it the same country?
Well, it's not the same country because you don't actually have anything in common. That's the problem, isn't it? That part of who we are is shaped by our history, is shaped by our family experiences, is shaped by the triumphs and tragedies that the country has been through in the last 150 years. It's part of who we are. And if you finish up with large numbers of people with whom you have nothing in common, well, clearly it's going to be a very different place, and one that's going to struggle to have a proper collective sense of what matters.
Again, speaking from the outside, as in, oh, well, if you just had a collective sense, if you just knew your neighbours, then actually English cities becoming minority English would be just fine, and I wouldn't have a problem with it.
He's also described a large part of the constituent elements of ethnicity and just omitted the fact that genetic heritage plays a part in whether or not you're going to buy into a given culture. So he's almost most of the way there, and then just sort of imposes a limit on himself because he's worried about being called racist by the exact kind of people that are going to call him racist anyway. Have you got the clip in here as well where he talks about the vast majority of British Muslims by any chance?
No, I left that bit out.
It's okay. That really annoyed me though.
I'm sure it did.
And I'm sure he's saying that because Zia Yusuf is now chairman, but it's like, Nigel, you had people on your GB News show a few weeks ago from the Henry Jackson Society that did some pretty robust polling after October the 7th that said the majority of British Muslims have a positive opinion of Hamas. So no, the vast majority of British Muslims are not concerned about radical Islam. I'm sorry to break it to you, and you're not going to make inroads with them. Instead, the only inroads you can make are the disenfranchised indigenous English who do not feel they can vote for anyone at the moment because they all sound the same. Sounding more like the establishment parties they won't vote for won't win you voters.
Thoughts, Charlie?
Thoughts? I mean, first of all, saying that history is just a part of who we are, obviously. I mean, it's not a part of who we are, it is who we are. I mean, it is fundamental. It's fundamental to who and what we are. I mean, I always find these appeals to collectivity rather strange. Not only because they're so beige, basically. It's a kind of beige sort of this communitarian vision, but also, I mean, for starters, we've never, even the English, we've never had a totally shared collective vision. I mean, it's a falsification actually of what a nation is. I mean, nations are riven by struggle. I mean, the class system in particular. But this sort of false vision that all we need is some sort of unifying big society type vision, that'll be fine. That'll be fine. I mean, it is boomerism at its worst. And, I only saw the first clip before I came here, and I had hoped that the rest of the interview wouldn't be as bad, but it's actually worse.
It actually gets a bit worse that we're going to go into. I'm going to make this a long segment because I think it's important. But you are right. The idea that there was a shared mass culture in which everyone bought into is a very post-World War II 20th century perspective because of mass media. Before, what you had is lots of regional settlements, essentially, where different regions got along with it. You can see this in Burke's lecture to the Bristol electors, in fact, where he talks about how regions of England rely upon one another and things like that. I don't actually agree with him on that one, the eventual conclusion he came to out of that, but the description is what's important there, because Devon is different to Northumbria, but they are still English, and they do have connections, but they are distinct, and so it's not this.
But the connections are physical, biological connections.
Also,
that's what cuts across.
Well, not just that. They're also sentimental and romantic. There's you have a romantic vision of parts of the country, but you are right. There is also a biological. It's a very, very deep thing to describe an ethnicity. But you're of course correct. It's partly biological. It's partly this. It's partly that. And Nigel's like, okay, I want the very thin BBC culture view that was produced in the 20th century. So everyone got, there were 3 channels or whatever when he was growing up, however many. So, and it's like, that just doesn't exist. But there are other things that underpin it that do exist that we can talk about. But like I said, it does get worse. So let's go to the next one.
In Birmingham recently, we saw anti-white graffiti painted on a school. This was in an area which was more than 90% non-white British, ethnically diverse, mostly kind of Asian population. We've also seen examples of anti-white discrimination in the RAF and more recently in the police. These were court cases, found that these people were discriminated against because of the colour of their skin. Is Britain becoming systemically racist against white people?
I think some of the institutions are, and the Royal Air Force perhaps is the best example of the lot. I mean, hey, surely you've got to pick people who are physically and technically the best people to be in the Royal Air Force. And I thought it's absolutely appalling what they've done. No, look, the problem is we're living in a 2-tier country. 2-tier attitudes towards employment, 2-tier attitudes towards policing. I mean, Black Lives Matter. Police officers taking the knee, dancing in the streets virtually. You get a rough crowd at a football game, and the policing's very, very different.
Fascinating response. Because Stephen began with non-institutional racism. There was someone had scrawled on a wall in Birmingham, "No whites," and Nigel immediately frames it. Well, I think the institutions are. Yeah, no, the institutions are as well.
It's this depersonalized perspective on politics we mentioned earlier, and this allows him to decouple it from a demographic perspective, because as we've discussed before, yes, there are brainwashed white female middle managers that are fully signed up to the diversity initiative because of pathological compassion, sure. But I don't think Humza Yousaf was making a nuanced point about anti-racist equality when he decried all of Scotland for being white. I think that's ethnic and tribal antagonism, and those people being in those institutions is a sort of unilateral inconsiderateness about merit because they want to advantage their own personal in-group.
But it's more than that, because as Parvini points out, it's an obsession with the institution. Nigel blinds himself to the real social racism against English people that is being felt in the 90% non-white, non-English area of Birmingham. And so when he says, there's definite anti-white racism in, we live in a 2-tier society, so they've got a 2-tier police, a 2-tier thing. He's, again, looking at the institution and their behaviour, not the motive behind all of this 2-tier nonsense, because it's not that they are being 2-tier because they're like, we just like having inequality and we just want one group to benefit. No, it's because they hate white people. It's because they hate the native English. And Farage has kind of, again, just moved the mirror so very slightly that you can't see that now. And so now it's the institution is not upholding an egalitarian liberal frame of one rule for all, rather than focusing on the genuine hatred of the native population that is being expressed through the nature of the 2-tier policing and whatnot. And so I just find it very interesting how he's just almost on the point at every point, but he can never actually stand on it. We're running a bit short of time, but we've got a couple more. Let's go for the next one. It's a good one.
In terms of the atmosphere in Britain, are you concerned that there is a rising level of anti-white hatred?
I'm just concerned about a deeply divided society. I'm concerned about a society which they tell us that they keep telling us the crime figures are improving. I think that's because people just don't bother to report crime anymore. People feel far less safe going out and about. And I know, I've spoken to a number of women who live in London who just want to leave, who just genuinely don't feel safe on the tube at night. So you know, all you have to do is open your eyes to see that we are living through societal decline. It frankly is a disaster.
The question was about anti-white hatred, not societal decline.
Who's committing the crime, Nigel? Who is making women feel unsafe in London, Nigel? Please answer the question, Nigel.
But this appeal to Britain as a deeply divided society, again, you know, historically we've always been a deeply divided society. I mean, you know, go back to the 19th century.
Go back to the Peasants' Revolt. Yeah, like, how far back do you want to go?
I don't think the Scousers have much love for the South.
Yeah, it's fine.
No, I mean that's no real metric, is it? Division in itself. No. I mean, you have, at the very least, you have to talk about specific kinds of division. But yeah, this is so bad.
The whole premise of populism is to take issues that have been put on rails outside the boundary of public debate and put them back into public debate. Yeah. But then this is demonized by being divisive, because the entire premise is that we are all equal, and so if decisions were made in our rational self-interest because we're all equal, then we'd all want to make the same decision. So by saying things are divisive, you're playing into their rhetoric and rendering your own populist revolt moot.
And moreover, again, you're appealing to something outside of people themselves. The abstract entity of society. So I'm actually not worried about the abstract entity of society. I'm worried about whether my daughter is going to be attacked when she's on the bus.
Yeah,
I'm worried about that.
Yeah, I'm not worried about people being unequal. In fact, that's something I support. Hierarchy.
Yeah,
you know, I mean, I don't. It's not that I don't want to live in a society where people are unequal. No, it's that there's a very different kind of society that I don't want to live in.
Yeah, I'd like to live in a society where people belong, instead of one. You know, and then anyway. So we'll finish on this next clip.
In the US, when they had a period of mass migration in the late 19th century, early 20th century, they closed their borders largely in the 1920s for, I think, almost 3 decades. Do you think Britain should do the same?
Pretty much. I think we should aim for... Let's give net zero a different meaning. I mean, people are always going to come and go, and we are a country that's engaged in international trade, and we have relationships around the world through the Commonwealth, etc. But yeah, we have to aim at a balanced migration policy.
But net zero still means hundreds of thousands of people coming into Britain, immigrants coming into Britain. Isn't that too many?
It may well be, but we have to start somewhere. We have to start somewhere. If we can get into people's minds that we have to try and stop this relentless rise in the population that's having a negative impact, that's where you start.
It's not purely the rise in the population, it's the demographic churn by having a net outflow of Brits and a net inflow of foreign nationals. That is the point. That's why Stephen's doing the Lord's work with this question.
It's also interesting, the comparison with the US, with mass immigration into the US at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. I mean, that was a huge thing. It was a huge thing, of course. Enormous numbers of people, but all European.
And they closed the borders for 30 years.
Yes, exactly. They closed the borders for 30 years. But what they had done is they had absorbed a huge number of assimilable people. And they did manage to assimilate them. And so, you know, Italian Americans and...
But even then, it led to rises in organised crime.
And
so
and even
still
I
has problems.
I wouldn't even say that was perfect. The fact that there are Italian Americans, Irish Americans, so, well, how assimilated are they?
Well, also, it was only over 15% of the American population. That's a very high number. London is currently 50% born abroad, not just second-generation immigrants. So,
but what I suppose what I mean is that actually the Americans could do something with the people who came. It might have taken time, and it did create distinct hyphenated cultures, but they actually contributed to the American project, and most people would say Italian Americans, they can stay. You know, they make good pizzas, good reality TV shows, and that sort of thing. But actually, the difference here is that we've already got millions of people who actually aren't going to assimilate, which is then, you know, you get onto the question of remigration, for example.
Well, okay, well, we'll play this last clip then if we want to get onto the question of remigration. Go on.
Do you support mass deportations?
Well, if people come illegally, they should not be allowed to stay. Simple as. Simple as. And the only way you're ever going to solve the channel, and boy, have a look at the last 3 days, unless they know that, number one, they'll never be granted refugee status by coming via this route, that number two, they're not going to stay, they'll keep coming.
But just back to the issue of deportations specifically, do you support that mass deportations? Trump says in America that he wants mass deportations. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants are in Britain at the moment. Some estimates say the number could even be in, 1 million plus. So do you support deporting all of those people?
It's impossible to do. Literally impossible to do. But do we have to begin the process? Yes. Look, we're told that we can't send people back to Afghanistan, right? That's impossible. Well, Germany, 2 weeks ago, did. Germany sent a plane load of people back to Afghanistan. If the Germans can do it, I'm certainly sure we can.
So why?
But if the Americans can do it, for example, in America, they are able to deport a lot of people. I know they haven't under this administration, but Trump was able to. It's not totally impossible, is it? I mean, it should be an ambition, at least. Is it your ambition?
For us, at the moment, it's a political impossibility.
But is it your ambition?
No.
It's not a political impossibility. The parties that are doing better than you in Europe and the US have promised it as a policy point. So you are alienating your voters by not promising it. And I don't care if it's a logistic impossibility. There are 1.5 to 2 million basically confirmed illegals here since 1998.
It's going to be way more than that.
Yeah, but we at least know that from the estimates provided by Pew Research, Oxford Migration Observatory, etc. They all need to be sent home because those are the illegals that you've said you need to be sent. So then don't renege on the commitment because of logistics. That's the most defeatist possible attitude. No, we didn't conquer half the world by saying, too big, can't be done. Like,
honestly, Wellington's campaigns in India, man, used to be like, it can't be done because he was literally outnumbered like 50 to 1 or something like that. It's staggering, the decline in Britain. Hi folks, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed that segment, and if you did, you can go and get issue 2 of Islander magazine from shop.lotus.com. It's available all across the world and of course contains the cutting edge of right-wing thought and the most relevant aesthetics you'll see anywhere. While you're at it, come and follow us over on Twitter, X, at _Lotuseaters_com, and I'll see you next time.